Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. Now, plastic is one of those things that exists everywhere. It's convenient and it's cheap. But it is also deadly, from plastic bags threatening marine life to the chemicals seeping into the soil from which we grow our produce. The insidiousness of plastic is widespread. The situation is so bad, in fact, that the UN estimates that by 2050, there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish. With all the alarming facts and news we hear about plastic, on today's show, we take a closer look at whether or not we are doing enough to fight against it. Joining us for this discussion today is Ms. Elvira Jimenez, who's a project leader for a plastic-free future at Greenpeace. She's joining us from Lorca. We're also joined by Mr. Michael Stephens, Director of Symphony Environmental Technologies, joining us from Hertfordshire. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Elvira, now let me begin with you. Just give us a sense of how much of the pollution we see today is made up of plastic. How much of plastic contributes to the mess we're seeing in the world today?
Well, thank you for having me. Well, we just have to think about some of the most staggering figures and the estimates that we have around us. We know that up to 12 million tons of plastics enter the oceans every year. We know that we've got more than 50 billion trillion particles in the oceans, and that's just like one part of the planet where we are actually seeing the most impact. We're not talking about the rest of the environment, rivers, lakes, mountains, everywhere in the environment. We also see plastic pollution, and also what we can personally see when we go out on the coast or to enjoy some marine environments. Right. We also have to consider that it's just on the surface, and most of it is still like on the seabed. Right.
Now, Mr. Stephens, now let me go and talk a little about how this plastic that we're seeing all around the world is being processed. The technology, is it keeping up with the systems needed to recycle it, to make it friendly to the environment? A single plastic bag can exist in the environment for over 450 years. Why aren't we tackling the situation in a more proactive manner?
Well, we are tackling it in a proactive manner, and our company in particular has scientists who've been working for 20 years to find the solution. Now, we've heard from the other contributor about the problem. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think we all know about the problem. We're told about it just about every day. What we're not told about is the solution, and the solution is what we have invented. We have invented a kind of plastic which is perfectly serviceable, but if it gets out into the open environment, it quickly turns itself into biodegradable material, ceases to be a plastic, becomes a biodegradable material, and is then recycled back into nature by the bacteria and the fungi that live out in the environment.
Right.
That's the solution.
Right. Now, you're talking about this technology. How are the costs working in this? Because the reason why plastic is so widespread and why it's used is because it's so cheap to produce. And the fact that producing another time is cheaper than actually recycling it. What are the costs like of your technology?
The costs are very low. We use ordinary plastic, and all we do is we add a very small 1% catalyst into the ordinary plastic. So the cost is negligible. But if, on the other hand, you're going over, as it seems that Islamabad want to do, to plastic made from food crops, we'd say two things about that. One, it's 4 times more expensive. I really don't think the people of Islamabad will be very pleased to pay 4 times as much for their plastic bag. Worse than that, that kind of plastic is not designed to degrade in the open environment. It's designed to be picked up and taken to a composting facility, right, and it will biodegrade there. But you don't have these composting facilities, do you?
Right. We're going to talk more about climate, the science behind all of this, and we're going to get to your point in just a bit. But before that, I'd like to jump back to Elvira and talk to her a little more about the dangers of this plastic. I mean, we talked about how widespread it is, the pollution that's being caused by it, but take us through the human cost of all of this.
Well, what we're seeing nowadays, especially during the last year, when we've had most of the plastic that is being produced in the northern countries, in the Western countries, but a lot of it is being actually exported as waste into Southeast Asian countries, which on the other hand have been largely also blamed as some of the high leakage countries, when actually what we're doing is we have this whole global trade of plastic waste that just keeps moving around in a way that doesn't make utterly no sense, and it's impacting those communities in those countries that have the least capacity to actually be able to tackle that waste. So as you were mentioning, it's not only an environmental problem, but it's actually a human problem, and it's affecting communities as they're being overwhelmed with all this waste. And we're having very impactful technologies like incineration also being established in a lot of these communities as the only way out to actually be able to tackle all this flow of waste that is being transported to them.
Right, and take us through that, the effects of how for so long when waste was exported to these nations, it was dumped in these nations. How does that change the geography of where the plastic resides mainly? Which regions in the world now would you say are the most polluted and that suffer the most with this problem?
Well, we're having more and more facts and data coming from scientific research around the world. As plastic, as you say, it's an issue that has a lot of interest in the public. But also one of the things that is happening also that unfortunately the oceans are in charge of actually sharing the whole pollution. And what we can find are high areas of concentration that are known as like plastic soups that happen in the different oceans. And then of course at a coastal level, we see that mainly in Southeast Asian countries and some Asian countries where you see a very high concentration on the beaches, very close to the ports, because that is where they're actually leaking from in the case of these countries. But plastic pollution is a worldwide problem, and we have very harsh figures, for example, in the Mediterranean, which is my region, that has a lot of impact on microplastics. We're having like new data also coming from the Arctic, the Antarctic. So it's hard to say that it's just standing in one place and that's the highly polluted area, and there is where we should focus all our effort. It's a global problem that requires systemic change.
Right. Mr. Stephens, now coming back to while you were explaining the science of the biodegradable products to me, one thing that struck me was that the fact that you were explaining it to me, it made sense. But most people don't have those explanations around. What needs to be done to make information more accessible? And how do you think that would change the concept regarding these materials and how they are used?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to thousands of people through your program. And this is the way we want to inform people. We hear a lot, and we've heard some more just now, about the problem. We're not hearing enough about the solution. Mm-hmm. Now, let me say two things about what we've just heard. The plastic soup in the oceans, if people had been using our technology 10 years ago, we would not have these plastic soups, and we would not be finding plastic particles in the Arctic because they would have degraded and biodegraded long ago. The second point is about recycling. I'm afraid that recycling has become a bit of a political obsession, and people are being encouraged to recycle plastic, which is simply not worth recycling, either in environmental or economic terms. And so local authorities in England are bailing up the plastic, sending it out to Malaysia to be recycled. And because it's not worth recycling, the people out there are just dumping it in the forests. Well, that's ridiculous. Instead of doing that, they ought to be taking these bales of plastic to a modern incinerator and turning that plastic into energy to generate electricity. Now, before anyone says that incinerators are dangerous, there is one in the middle of Zurich producing energy from waste, and they wouldn't have it in the middle of Zurich if it was dangerous, would they?
Right. So, Mr. Stephens, thank you so much for that comment and for telling us more about what the solutions possibly could look like. And thank you for talking to us. That was Mr. Michael Stephens talking to us. Ms. Elvira, going back to you and talking a little about what needs to be done on an international scale. We talked a little about how the plastic was shifted from some parts of the world to the other parts of the world. And we also see how it's a global problem, but there don't seem to be global mechanisms to actually address it. What do you think needs to be done on an urgent basis?
Well, thank you very much for making that question, because actually it's absolutely right that we don't have that strong international effort as you would see on in other fronts. And actually, there's more action being taken, for example, at a political level, setting the grounds to actually achieve that systemic change that I was referring to before. Because before we actually speak about, for example, recycling, as we are mentioning, we have to go up the waste hierarchy and also think about another term that right now is being used a lot, which is circularity in the circular economy. And the first steps for this are reduction and then reuse. And we're not talking about what the benefits would be. First, reducing that amount of waste and all the amount of single-use packaging that is being produced, and then how to implement reuse systems, which are already happening, are being tested around the world. And that is being done at a local and national level, but at an international level, we don't see that much effort also to limit and to make companies accountable for all the waste that they have created. That is largely being missed.
Right. And stay with us on that point, Elvira. I'll introduce another guest who's joined us, Mr. Hari Srinivas, who's a professor of global environmental policy at Kwansei Gakuin University, joining us from Japan. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Srinivas. Now, while we're talking about all of the international policies that need to be put in place in order to tackle the problem we see today, tell us and take us through the policy measures that actually can be applied all across the board, whether they are developed nations or whether they are developing nations, the basic policies.
Okay. Internationally, I think what has started to happen is countries are coming together, and the more the data and research that's going on into plastic pollution, the higher the chances these issues are addressed at the UN level. Just in March this year, for example, more than 140 countries came together in Kenya during the UN environment meeting, and they made a pledge to make sure that they will reduce the amount of plastics that are being used worldwide. Of course, unfortunately, these global agreements, especially this plastic one that took place in March 2019, are voluntary. So the onus of taking action lies with the countries or member countries, as the UN calls them, in taking action. The second global initiative that has taken place very recently is the inclusion of plastic as one of the pollutants within the Basel Convention. The Basel Convention is the transboundary movement of waste materials and the tracking of these waste materials to make sure that it does not affect third countries. Now, Basel Convention and this new initiative by UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, to take hold of this plastic pollution problem, faces what I call the grandmother dilemma, where that's the local action. How do you take these Basel Conventions, these UN agreements, and explain it to your grandmother so that he or she can take action at the local level?
And that's a very important point you put there, the grandmother dilemma. And that's the question I put to our guest earlier as well. How do we put all this information that's out there that's technical? I mean, there's more and more news about climate change. There's more and more news about how all of these products are harmful to the environment. But the news is often so technical that a layman might not understand it. What needs to be done to make it more accessible?
I think the main point there is options. Look, as a grandmother, you are aware of plastics not being good for the environment, etc., but you don't know what to do. You don't know what your options are. You don't know that what you can do on a daily basis to actually reduce plastics. But what we have to remember here is that there's a long journey of plastics from production all the way to disposal and beyond. What we are focusing right now is predominantly how ordinary people, the grandmothers, can actually do to reduce plastics. But what we are missing out on the picture is what businesses can do.
And Mr. Srinivas, stay with me on that point. I want to go back to Elvira and talk to her a little about that. The role that these multinational companies are playing in the production of plastic, they have powerful lobbies all across the world. They want to keep their costs low. Producing plastic, using plastic packaging is a way to make sure that their costs are low. What needs to be done in order to counter their influence, in order to tackle them head on?
Well, thankfully, there's the increasing awareness. I've worked also in other environmental issues, and I don't think that there's such an awareness with other issues as in plastic, maybe only with climate change. So we really have that as an opportunity to be able to put pressure on those who are pumping the plastic into society every single day. And this is just a symbol of the throwaway culture as a whole. So we see increasingly not only environmental organizations, but we see local communities, stories of small businesses, startups that are actually questioning this throwaway model and that are putting forward solutions that are based on reduction and on reuse, and we have to focus on that energy, on all those people, all this movement that is happening globally, and they're asking for a systemic change. And companies are hearing this because just a few years ago it was only recycling that was what they wanted to put forward, and now they're talking about other so-called solutions that are not really dealing with the core problem of why we got here in the first place, is that we're just involved in a throwaway culture that makes us just dispose of things and give them no value at all. So now with all this movement that is happening, and people are really demanding to have another way to have access to products, this is what is making companies start to shift and start to change also their own story. It's not just individuals to blame anymore. It's not a littering problem, as it has been said so in the last years, but it's a problem that requires corporate action and political action. And I really do believe that they're starting to hear this, and it is starting to change, and we just have to keep amplifying this message.
Right. Mr. Srinivas, on that point, as Elvira was talking about, that these companies are hearing the message that there is this environmental consciousness that is at play. But when we look around ourselves, the most powerful corporations out there still sell their drinks in plastic bottles. They still wrap their items in plastic. There doesn't seem to be a change quick and fast enough. And by 2050, if we're seeing figures that there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish, what needs to be done at a global level or even at a national level to take a hold of these corporations and to penalize them, or at least make them abide by more environmentally friendly policies?
There's one surprising corner of the story that doesn't get much attention: codes and standards. You see, there is ISO globally. This is a UN organization that sets out standards of products, quality standards of products. And one of the most important points that big businesses look at is making sure the product reaches the customer safely without any damages. This means that almost 80 to 90% of the plastics we produce actually goes for packaging. Now, if the ISO, for example, helps countries to set up standards that says that plastic packaging should not be used, or like paper, at least 80% of the plastic should be recycled, etc. If the standards, if the movement to change the standards happens at the global level, countries will have to pick it up. and
Right.
then set up. For example, Japan here has a law, a plastic recycling law, and a packaging law that specifically calls for using recyclable materials in packaging. It also calls for manufacturers to take back their plastic that they used in the packaging.
Right.
So these kind of
Right. Hold on to that thought, Mr. Srinivas. I want to introduce our guest who's joined us, Dr. Imran Khalid, Research Fellow at Sustainable Development Policy Institute, joining us from Islamabad. Thank you so much, Dr. Khalid, for joining us and talking to us. Now, Dr. Khalid, while we're talking about sustainability, an argument is often made that countries that are on the path to development shouldn't be put on the same standards as the more developed nations, because the burden will come on the poorest of the poor. Now, how do you move towards sustainability while ensuring to protect the poor from having to suffer the costs?
Yeah, so let's not repeat the mistakes that have been made by the developed powers, people who've already gone through this process before us. And we know the harm that they've done to the planet in developing in the fashion that they have. So there are lessons to be learned. We know for a fact that pollution and environmental degradation impacts the poor first and foremost. And so keeping that in mind, we need to have sustainability and sustainable development in mind when we are thinking about development processes. So this means when we're talking about plastics, we need to talk about extended producer responsibility. And we need to talk about how companies and governments can come together in ensuring that the waste that is being produced is being returned to the economy so that it becomes a part of what's known as the circular economy, so that we don't see plastic ending up in the ocean.
Right.
The other that your audience might already know of is the hazards of microplastics that are coming up. So, but it's a process. We won't be able to do something within a period of 6 months or even a year. It's going to take us time in order to resolve these things, but let's get started and let's communicate.
Right. Dr. Khalid, just on this point, though, while we're talking about the fact that sustainable development and we should learn from the mistakes made in the past, let's talk a little about whether sustainable development, in fact, is more costly than regular development. Is that a myth, or would you say there is truth in that?
I don't think it's costly. There's a misperception that it is costly, that the developing countries are being shortchanged when it comes to environmental issues and climate change because the developed countries have, tread a path that helped them. That's not the case. The problem is that we've never incorporated environmental externalities into our economic models. For example, whenever you develop a coal power plant, we need to understand the impacts that it is going to have on the health of the people who are living in that area, the impact that it's going to have on air pollution in other parts of the country as well as in other parts of the world. So when you start to do that, you realize that environmental friendly policies and those that cater to sustainable development are really the way forward.
Right. Elvira, just a last question to you. Seeing all the production in the world, seeing that there is more awareness regarding it, and seeing that both of those factors are trying to reconcile with each other, what trajectory do you see production going towards? Where do you see us heading on our fight against plastic?
Well, I see that we should be pushing for new delivery models based on reduction and reuse, and that is already happening, and that is already being tested, as I said before, and that's really the way forward, because like that we're really, as they were mentioning right now, the previous speaker, we're really making the most of the resources that we are using from our planet, and that's what we have to think about, creating as less waste as possible, and every resource that we use, make sure that it goes through a cycle and that it's used to its maximum potential. And that's what is happening also at political level. In the European Union, for example, we are having already some measures put in place. There's things happening in different countries, zero waste communities appearing. And that's really the vision of where we see that we should be going and what we should be focusing on this new vision of a system of a world that is based on reduction and reuse rather than continue to throw away.
Right. Mr. Srinivas, talking about this and the fact that we're in a crisis, climate crisis, and there needs to be a lot of changes, do you see there needing to be, as Mr. Khalid also said, a reworking of the economic model that is in place in order for us to get more drastic solutions as opposed to just measures that are optics?
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Khalid put it very nicely, actually. The whole concept of a green economy, of an economy that takes into account the environmental and other social aspects, which in fact is sustainable development. That is something that we need to really look at for the future. Models of circular economy or a green economy that really understands this interlinkages and impacts between the different sectors. In fact, what we need to understand is this patterns of policies, from global policies that are handled by the UN to national policies to city-level policies.
Mr. Srinivas, since we're running short on time, and I just last comments from Dr. Khalid as well. Dr. Khalid, how well do you think Pakistan is moving towards sustainable development?
I think the glass is half full. We need to do a lot more than what we're doing right now. Just banning plastic bags isn't going to get us there. That it means you need to start involving the communities on the ground. You need to start involving the industry and coming up with plans that span years rather than months. Because in order to have a sustainable solution to our woes, we'll have to come up with a collective action to resolve these issues. And I think there's a long road ahead for us, but there are examples from the world that we can rely on to take us there.
Right. On that note, thank you so much, Imran Khalid, for joining us. Thank you, Elvira Jimenez, for joining us. And thank you, Srinivas, for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to have another story for you. Stay with us.